So in this video, we're going to be looking at the JavaScript History API. And this is really interesting because it'll allow you to modify the browser history in a way that you previously wouldn't have been able to do. Now by this, I mean that you can control parts of your page based on pushing a state to the browser history. So at the moment, you can see I've got my developer tools open here. I can just right click and inspect element, or you can access this from the tab here. And when I click on one of these links, what's actually happening here is you can obviously see that the URL is changing, but this content here is actually being loaded in via an AJAX request. Now these pages, cats.php and dogs.php, do actually exist. When I land on dogs.php, for example, it still loads the same content. And this is really important because the History API should not be a drop-in replacement for pages that actually exist. To do something like that, you'd use hashbangs at the end of URLs, which are commonly not advisable to use. But in this video, we can allow content to be loaded in without an entire page refresh unless the user clicks on the page like that, in which case the content will be loaded in normally. So what we're going to be doing then is looking at building up this very basic page, creating a very basic application structure. It's not going to be anything that you might use in a project, but it'll at least give you a good idea of how you can implement the JavaScript History API to loading content in this way. So let's jump right over to the code and start building this. So we're actually starting out with a very basic structure here, and I'm going to explain how this is set up. Then what we're going to do is add in the JavaScript that we need to make this work. So first of all, if we just close off these folders here, you can see that in my main directory, I've got a cats.php file and I've got a dogs.php file. This is just mocking what you'd normally see within an application where we separate the header, the footer, and the content that we want to load in. So you can see that these pages are identical except for the content that we're loaded in. Depending on the structure of your application, this is obviously going to be different. If you're using a framework and actually showing views and doing things in a really clean way, it doesn't make a difference. The concept here is exactly the same. So inside of our just views folder I've created, we've got a header here, and this is just a basic document layout with a head, a body. Now within the body, we have this navigation element here. So we have an HTML5 nav element with an ID of main. That's going to allow us to target that with jQuery. We're going to be using jQuery, which is a JavaScript library, just because this makes teaching History API a little bit simpler. And then we've obviously got an unordered list, 2 list items, and within that we've got 2 anchor tags which are linking through to them 2 pages within our root directory here. Now on cats and dogs.php, we're loading in from the content folder, which is over here, and that's just some basic content. So this is essentially just the part that you'd be loading in here. So at the moment, this page looks exactly the same as when I showed you it a moment ago. The only thing is we're loading the entire page with each click of this. And that's fine, but what if we want to load in just this part when we navigate to these items? And this is a good idea because it saves you having to reload an entire page, sending another request to the server. And it also looks a little bit smoother and quicker to your users as well. That's, I guess, the main benefit here. So what we're going to be doing then is in the footer, we're going to be building out the code. You would obviously link this off to a separate JavaScript file, but for the sake of the video, we'll keep it all in one file. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to pull in jQuery. So I've got some script tags here with a source attribute. If we head over to Google hosted libraries, just Google for that, and we want to pull in jQuery. This just provides us an easy way to pull in jQuery from Google's content delivery network, just so we don't have to go through the process of downloading it ourselves. So I'm going to pop that in there. And on the next line then, just an empty script tag. Again, you'd want to put this in a separate JavaScript file, but in our case, we'll write all of the code that we need to just in here. So the first thing that we want to do then is go ahead and make sure the DOM's loaded. So we're going to use document within a jQuery selector, and we're going to use the ready method. Inside of that is a closure, and we can start writing all of our code in here. So I'm going to create two variables, one called nav and one called content. These are going to hold the navigation selector, so we can actually detect when an item is clicked, and also a content selector, so we can inject the content from the AJAX request into that content area. So the nav then is going to be nav hash main. So this is nav with an ID of main. And the content, if you noticed before over in these files, it's a section element with an ID of content. So we can reference that either just the hash on its own, or you can explicitly define section. You obviously shouldn't have IDs with the same matching on the same page, so you shouldn't have 2 of main or 2 of content or 2 of more. So we've now got the nav and the content selected. So we've got the section with an ID of content and the nav with an ID of main. So what we can do now then is actually create an event handler when a user clicks on one of these elements inside of this unordered list. So one of these anchors here. So to do that then, we're going to say nav.find a. So we're finding any anchor element within that. And we're using the on method to register an event handler, in this case when we click. So now we're going to run a callback here. And inside of here, what do we want to do? Well, we want to get the href of that element. So in here, it's got cats.php and dogs.php. We know that because we're linking through to them pages. That's pretty self-explanatory. So let's create a variable up here. And this is going to be this, which references the current element we're clicking. And then we're going to say attribute. This is a method that grabs the value of an attribute. And the attribute of these is href, pretty straightforward. So now what we want to do is actually manipulate the history. So we're going to say manipulate history. Now we're going to actually start to get to the history API. And this is so straightforward. So what we want to do is we want to use history. We want to use the push state method. Now bear in mind, I'm not checking for history API support. So in a browser that's older and maybe doesn't support history API, you will get an error here because obviously this method doesn't exist, or this global functionality doesn't exist. However, you could go ahead and use something like Modernizer, if you just Google for that, to actually detect whether this is available or not. So the arguments for this, first of all, is an object which we're not going to need. This just allows you to provide additional details about this, but we don't need that. All we're interested in is pushing the actual file name onto the end of the URL. We can also provide a title as well if you want to modify the title of the page. We don't necessarily need that. You can do that if you want. And this just takes a string value, so that's an option. But what we're interested in is pushing this onto the end of the URL, which is the href we obtained from that anchor. So what we can actually do here then is have a look. When I click cats and dogs, you can see at the moment it is still reloading the page. So what do we need to do? Well, obviously within this event handler, we want to prevent the default behavior when a user clicks that link. We don't actually want that to go through to the page. We're loading it in via an AJAX request. So up here, as an argument for the callback, we can provide E, which is the event, and then we can say event.prevent default, and that prevents the default behavior of that link. And that all that means is when I click on these now, you can see that nothing is happening. We're not reloading the page. However, if you've noticed, the URL is actually changing. So if I just remove this href for now and just enter blah, for example, you'll actually see that this will take effect. So when I click these, you can see that's changed to blah. But obviously we don't need that. We want the href in there. So now that we are manipulating the browser history, let's just go back to a sensible page. We actually need to change this content here. That's really important because that's the whole point of using the history API. So if we just go down here, we want to fetch and insert content. But what we're going to do is extract this to a function so we can actually reuse this if we want to. It just makes it a little bit cleaner. So fetch and insert, that's going to be the name of the function. And we want to define as an argument the actual href that we want to obtain, so the file name basically. Now when you're passing through the file name, obviously the file names here match the file names within this content directory. That might not be the case, so you might have to come up with another creative solution to handle this. And you could do something like a data attribute, for example. So a data attribute is basically an attribute you can put onto an element, name it here how you want, and then provide some kind of value in here. So if you had, say, an entirely different way of fetching the files that you want to pull in, perhaps you want to actually go off to some kind of URL and pull in content that way, that is an option. And if you did want to do that, instead of using attribute, you could use data and then something like content. So you can go ahead and modify this obviously how you need. This isn't a sort of full-scale application. So we need to build this fetch and insert function now. We can do that just up here. So if we say fetch and insert, we want that to be a function. And don't forget, we need to end there with a semicolon, and we want to define fetch and insert up here as a variable. Okay, so what do we need to do in here? Obviously we need to pull in the href from the arguments, and we want to make an AJAX request to a file. So we're going to use jQuery's AJAX functionality, and we're going to pass through an object. We want to define the URL here. So the URL is essentially going to be, if we just copy and paste this into there, and then we want to go into content, and then we want this to be X. So X we're going to replace with the href that we've pulled in. So we'll need to update this a little bit later when we look at the users using their back and forward button. So for now we'll put href, but like I said, we're going to have to do something a little bit different with this a bit later on. It's not too tricky. So we're going to define a method. You don't need to do this. The AJAX method on jQuery will automatically default to get, but it's always nice to explicitly define it. And we want to change the cache to false, just so we add a timestamp onto the end of the request so we don't get cached content. And then we have a success callback. So this is when that file here has been hit successfully, and that provides us with the data or the content of the file. You might also wish to implement an error callback as well, and you can just do whatever you want in there. So what we now want to do is we want to modify the content. In actual fact, let's pull these up here. That makes sense. And then we can do something like content.html data. And we're going to be considering security in just a moment. I'm going to talk about how users may be able to access other files by modifying these within the developer tools. But we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the video, and then you can go ahead and implement the security as you see fit. So now that we have our fetch and insert method, we'll just comment this out. So fetches and inserts content into the container. That's pretty obvious. And that's pretty much it for now. Let's just check out what this does. So if we just refresh the page here, I'm going to pull up my network tab. This is always useful to keep an eye on. You can use the filter here to filter XHR requests. So that means that when I click here, you can see that content changing. It's changing within our browser, and we also see the requests here with the timestamp and other bits and pieces of information. But we now know that this is pulling content in via an AJAX request. The URL is updating itself, and it's working as expected. But what happens when a user presses back in their browser? Well, you can see that although I'm pressing back and forward and the URL is changing, the content isn't changing. And this is pretty frustrating because users do use the back and forward button in their browser. So what we want to do then is we want to handle this. So down here, we're going to say user goes back forward, and we need to handle this in a slightly different way. So when the user presses back or forward, we have something called a pop state event fired. and we can target the window in the jQuery selector, and we can use on, much like we did with the links, and we can say on pop state. So we can run a callback, and then we can do something within here. So there's no way within here to be able to reliably get the name of this here unless we use the path name of the location, which is the following. So this is going to be a little bit tricky if, like I mentioned earlier, you wanted to use a data attribute. But once you know how to implement this, you can go ahead and integrate it into your application as you need and try and work out what works best for you. This isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but it will teach you the basics. So we're going to do fetch and insert, but this time we're going to do a fetch and insert on location path name. So location path name is going to give us the full path. So let's just comment this out for a moment, and we'll do a console log on location dot path name. And let's see what happens when we refresh, click a couple of links here, and then go back. So I've got my console open here. I've done that using this toggle here, or you can hit the console tab to see that exclusively. And you can see that what's happening is it's giving me the path name here relative to the actual domain. And at the moment I'm working on localhost. So we need to actually grab the last part of this. So that's pretty straightforward. Let's uncomment out fetch and insert. And we'll get rid of this console log. So for the href then, we actually want to split this by a /. So all we do is use the split method on this object, and we choose the character we want to split it by. In this case, it's a /. And then we use pop to basically grab the last element, or pop the last element off and return that. So now what's going to happen is if we were to, for example, just take this snippet here and just console log it down here. So do a console log on that, and then just go ahead and comment all that out. We'll see that when we hit a few links, we can see that happening there, but when we go back and forward, we get the same result. So we now know that we're ending up with the content that we want to Ajax to. So let's get rid of this console log, uncomment out the Ajax, and we know that this should work now. So now, as well as hitting dogs or cats.php, we can click through, pull in them Ajax request as we've seen, but when I hit the back and forward button, it keeps up to date with the content. So it knows when I'm navigating through back and forward to actually fire that event, go and send an Ajax request to the relevant file and pull back the content for us. So that is pretty much it. There is a lot more to the History API, but this should be a good introduction for you to go ahead and implement this into your own application and see what you can do with it and see the difference it will make to user experience. Now, the last thing I mentioned I was going to talk about was actually security. So say, for example, you had a file within content.php. Let's just save this as secret.php. This can be anything, so it could be maybe a JSON file, a text file, a log file. It could be absolutely anything. In actual fact, let's set this to JSON. So let's say we had some kind of secret key that we were storing in here that we weren't protecting against. Now that's obviously a silly idea anyway. You wouldn't store files within your public directory without applying some kind of rule to this to not allow it to be accessed via a browser. But in this case, what a user could do is, if you have left files unsecured like this, is we could inspect this anchor here. So for example, cats, we could take this and we could change this to secret.json. And obviously you'll imagine that because we're taking this href explicitly and then asking for an Ajax request on this file, when we hit cats, you can see, okay, so perhaps using JSON was a bad example. Let's just rename this to txt just so we can play around with this. And let's change this to txt. Oops. Let's go back here to cats. So we are going to modify the href here. to secret.txt. When we click on that, we get that content through. So regardless of whether it's JSON file, a text file, anything, please make sure that you're securing files in a way that makes sense before you allow users to specify which file they're going to AJAX through to. Obviously, an AJAX request is a front-end request to a file, so you should be securing files anyway, but it's just a little heads up to make sure that's implemented within your application. So that's it. There we go. We have taken a basic look at the History API. Hopefully it's a little bit more understandable now with this basic functionality, and you can go ahead and start using it.